Hello, everybody. Welcome back to what really is still the first lecture from rhetorical criticism. Now, in the meeting on Wednesday, we got through the first slide. There's only a few more slides, but really that first slide I do intentionally spend a lot of time with because I want to make sure you have a strong grasp of the notion of rhetoric. What I'm doing here is talking more about rhetorical criticism. What do I mean by rhetorical criticism? What are the goals and so forth? So let's begin. Rhetorical criticism is a systematic study of artifacts, meanings, and use of symbols. So if we break that down just a little bit, first off, it's systematic. And by the way, it's grounded in theory. So as opposed to you watch a speech, and I mean, we sort of did it with Ray, we just watched and had some general reaction. But as opposed to watching a speech, a film, listening to some music, what have you, whatever your artifact is, right? Artifact being that thing that you're studying. As opposed to just saying, here's what I think about it, here's how it strikes me. I mean, that's really not doing criticism, right? That's personal response more than anything. So it's systematic because it's grounded in theory. And if you, if you look at the first chapter of Yield textbook, it has that section there in chapter 1. I'm going to flip to it for a moment there. Right, and it starts laying out the different perspectives, and it calls it step 2, and it says selecting a rhetorical perspective, and it has neo-Aristotelian, which we'll talk about starting on Monday. We'll talk about neo-Aristotelian criticism, but it talks about feminist illusion of life, which is actually refers to music, the visual perspective. It refers to media center. There's references to what's a dramatistic, symbolic convergence. I think also narrative should be in there. If you're reading all of that, you don't need to know for this first chapter really the ins and outs and the depths of all of that. What the author is doing there is a couple of things. One, previewing for you what are the methods that we're going to be exploring in the textbook and in the class. So that's one thing that's going on there. The other thing is she's emphasizing right away that when you approach the artifact, you approach it from a particular perspective. You go into it informed by a theory, right? And a theory explains the relationship of ideas to each other, right? So you go into your analysis with a certain methodology that's grounded in theory that tells you what it is that we're looking for and why those things matter. Right? So it tells us what we're looking for and why those things matter. So it's systematic because it's grounded in theory that guides us in our analysis rather than us just watching it and thinking about how the message strikes us. Right? Here, the definition I have, rhetorical criticism, emphasizes that difference of message and meaning. Right? So study of artifacts, meanings, and the use of symbols. And this goes back to what is my understanding of a definition of communication, one that differentiates between meaning and messages. So a message is the speech, the photograph that's published, it is the book, it is the film, it's the television show. That's the message. The meaning are how we interpret and understand those symbols. Right? That's the meaning. And so message and meaning are being differentiated here, right? So what are the meanings, right? The different ways that we interpret and understand that artifact. And there's an emphasis in all this on choices, right? What choices is the rhetor making? So again, we looked at the Challenger speech, and Reagan talks about really with the astronauts having been brave explorers who knowingly went into risk, right? So they are full of agency, they're taking the risk, as opposed to them being described, right? A different choice would be describing them as being victims to somebody's failure, right? But that's not how they're being talked about. That's not how they're being eulogized. So an emphasis on choices, right? The choices that are being made, choices that are not made. And all this is never conclusive. As a rhetorical critic, you are making a compelling argument for the interpretation according to the method that you're using. Right? So, but it's never conclusive. That is never the meaning of the artifact. But you're offering what is a compelling case, a compelling argument for that particular meaning. So communication research. This course is one of the 3 communication research methods courses you can take. The others are quantitative research and qualitative research. So I want to talk about research for a moment. Right? Quantitative, qualitative, rhetorical. There we are. So on the left side, I've shown you the ways that we might differentiate the different rhetorical methods. And I'll try to go over this somewhat quickly, but still be clear, but talking about why rhetorical research is different from other forms of research, and why other forms of research are different from rhetorical research. None of them is really better than the other, but because they all serve different means. So, for instance, the goal of qualitative research is to predict. That really is the goal, is you're trying to predict behavior, predict action, predict people with certain attitudes or attributes, what they're going to do, how a message will affect them, right? At election time, we use quantitative research to predict how people are going to vote, right? But quantitative research is largely about prediction. We refer to control, and it doesn't mean controlling people, but getting a sense of how to account for different factors that impact and affect the decisions that people make. So that, again, so we can predict those decisions. Qualitative research, if you've taken qualitative research, which is taught by Dr. Dorgan, Dr. Anser teaches quantitative research. But qualitative research, as it's taught by Dr. Dorgan, right, focuses on explaining people's experiences. So as opposed to predicting the experience of people with cancer, the emphasis is much more on explaining and understanding the experiences of people with cancer. And rhetorical criticism is also very interested in explaining. Now, I'm not going to focus so much on a group of people and their experience with cancer, but I'm going to explain what have been the depictions that we see of cancer. So I'd look at various films that deal with cancer, and I would talk about how do they depict it. I would explain how have we depicted it, how do we talk about cancer, how do we make out the experience of cancer. Quantitative samples are large, right? Sample meaning how many people you're looking at. Well, you look at a lot of people. You want to look at 200, 300, maybe even in the thousands, depending on what you're doing, right? And you have a large sample, right? This large sample, because when it gets big like that, quantitatively, you can now begin to predict, right? And so prediction relies upon having a large sample. Sometimes you can use a smaller sample, but it usually means it's something that's not very hard to predict. So that's called effect size, and we're not getting into it here. But you give a large sample, often getting as close as you can into the hundreds. Right? Qualitative research relies on a modest sample. You interview, 15 people can be a lot. You might interview 8, you might interview 4. So it's those 4 people, those 8 people, those 15, but it's really in depth. So it's a modest sample, as opposed to a big sample that you very likely survey, or maybe you're observing the characteristics of a lot of people in quantitative research. And in qualitative, it's a smaller sample to really go in deep and understand that smaller set of people and their experience. In rhetorical research, our sample is very limited. It may be one, right? It may be a single movie, a single episode of a TV show, or it may be limited, looking at 2 or 3 movies, 2 or 3 episodes, or 2 or 3 TV shows as a small sample, right? So it may be limited. It may be exclusive. As I say, it may just be the one. We just want to look at this president's inaugural address. That's it. We just want to look at this one film, right? So I'm just going to look at Wonder Woman. Just going to focus on one film to think about the depiction of women as superheroes or action heroes, action stars, that sort of thing, right? So it's going to be exclusive. And as opposed to in quantitative and qualitative, where you are more likely, well, in quantitative especially, qualitative less so, to be trying to pick people in your sample that are representative of the sample, right? They sort of represent. In rhetorical criticism, we may just look at the unique. We may look at the one, we look at it, we say, that one is different than the rest, right? One of these is not like the other, right? That's rhetorical critics field day, right? The one that doesn't belong. And we say, gosh, what's that about? Why is it like that? Why doesn't it belong? That's what a rhetorical critic is interested in, or may be interested in. Generalizability. From my study, how much can I use that to talk about the larger population? Right? So from the sample of voters, we want to be able to generalize to the larger sample of voters. Right? From this sample of people who have been only children raised by a single parent, just coming up with things, right? We want to have a sample that allows us to hopefully generalize to other people who are an only child raised by a single parent. So it's a very strong emphasis. Qualitative is much more moderate, and it may be to somewhat unique experience that people have. The goal isn't necessarily to generalize. It may very well or may often help us to understand what many people experience, but there's not a strong emphasis, I would say, and others may correct me, on it being generalizable per se. Right? Rhetorical criticism, the generalizability is often sort of weak, and occasionally it does happen, right? It's occasional. Sometimes we say we are looking at this movie and how we're seeing family depicted, how we're seeing what we're seeing in terms of difference of white families and Latinx families and African American families, and talk about how that might be part of a larger trend. So occasionally it is sort of generalizable, but that's not always the goal. It's to look at this one thing and then later on consider, are others like it or not? Not to say this is generalizable, but saying, here's this example. As we find other instances, we can go back and look and say, that's much like what we saw there with that movie about how families represented, or about what we see of women as superheroes. So it's weak or occasionally generalizable. The context, we've talked about this in the first lecture that we had on Wednesday. The context of or quantitative research is behavioral. We didn't really talk about that part, but often it's people's behaviors, what they're going to do, what they do, the attitudes they hold, how that indicates the behavior they're going to engage in. Qualitative research, I would argue, is largely behavioral. Some might disagree with me on that. I'm very open to that criticism. But again, largely the experiences people have, the emotions they have, how do they experience that, right? So it's behavioral, right? And we talked about that the rhetorical context is really one that's more about public. So less about behavior, but more about what are people being told, what are people being shown, how are many people being asked to feel about something, right? So it's that, again, that one to many, if you will. And the researchers themselves in quantitative research are social scientists, right? Social scientists among the likes then of, say, sociologists and psychologists and political scientists. Hey, they even get science in their name, right? So those would be social scientists. Qualitative researchers may identify as social scientists. They may identify as humanists. Humanists being those who are more interested in or more closely aligned with literature, philosophy, history, right? We might think of more humanist. So less of a predictive, behavior-oriented, and more about understanding, appreciating, getting a sense into humans and how they behave. And so rhetoricians are pretty squarely, they are humanists. We're really not social scientists. We're humanists. That's who we are. All right, I'm going to pause here just to make these lectures not too big as we finish up this first lecture on what is rhetoric and rhetorical criticism.